The coach station at Millbrook stood nearly empty that evening, benches damp from an earlier rain, lanterns guttering against the wind, and Clemency Ward gave up her seat by the fire to an old woman who could barely stand on her own 2 feet. And if this story moves you, stay until the very end. And tell me in the comments what city you are watching from tonight, because the frail traveller Clemency helped into that warm corner seat was not simply a stranger passing through, she was the mother of the most powerful duke in the county, and what Clemency did not know that evening would return to her. Clemency Ward had been raised to expect very little from the world and had, in the 26 years since her birth, received almost exactly that. Her father, a modest wool merchant, had died in debt when she was 17, and her mother had followed him into the churchyard not 2 winters later, worn down by grief and hard work in equal measure, leaving Clemency alone to manage what remained of the family's small shop in Millbrook, a narrow storefront that sold thread and the occasional bolt of undyed wool to villagers who mostly preferred to buy on credit and pay, if they paid at all, months later and in installments. She had learned early that the world did not owe her softness, and she had learned just as early that softness, offered freely regardless of what the world owed her, was the one thing she refused to surrender, no matter how thin her own circumstances grew. She fed stray cats she could not afford to feed. She mended a neighbour's coat for free when the neighbour's own children went hungry rather than ask for help. She gave up her seat, her bread, her hours again and again to anyone who seemed to need them more than she did, and the villagers of Millbrook had come, over the years, to regard her with a peculiar mixture of affection, admiring her kindness even as they shook their heads at what they considered her foolish inability to look after her own interests first. That particular evening the coach station was nearly deserted, most travellers having taken shelter from the earlier rain in the inn across the square, and only a handful of benches remained occupied, one by a drowsy farmer waiting for the late coach to Aldbury, another by 2 young men arguing quietly over a game of cards, and the bench nearest the small iron stove, the only warm seat in the entire station, occupied by Clemency herself, who had walked the 2 miles from her shop specifically to catch the evening coach to her cousin's farm, where she intended to spend a rare and much-needed week away from the endless grind of her ledgers. She had claimed that seat early, had warmed her hands gratefully against the stove's meagre heat, and had settled in with the particular contentment of a woman who did not often permit herself small comforts and intended for once to enjoy one fully. It was into this scene that the old woman entered, moving with slow, careful steps through the station's narrow door, leaning heavily on a plain wooden cane, her cloak soaked through at the hem from the earlier rain, her face pale and drawn with an exhaustion that seemed to reach far deeper than mere travel weariness. She was dressed plainly enough, a grey travelling cloak, sturdy but unremarkable boots, nothing about her appearance that suggested wealth or status, and she looked about the station with the particular helplessness of a traveller who has gone too long without rest and has nearly reached the end of her own strength. Clemency watched her for only a moment before she rose from her seat, because watching an old woman search in vain for somewhere warm to sit was simply not a thing Clemency Ward was capable of doing without acting, whatever the cost to her own comfort. "Here," she said, moving toward the old woman and offering her arm for support. "Please take my seat by the stove. You look as though you have had a very long day, and I confess I do not need the warmth nearly so badly as you seem to." The old woman looked at her with pale, tired eyes, surprise flickering behind the exhaustion, as though she had expected from long habit to be overlooked entirely in a public waiting room, and she hesitated a moment before accepting Clemency's offered arm. "You are very kind," the old woman said. her voice thin but cultured, carrying a precision of diction that did not entirely match her plain traveling clothes, a detail Clemency noticed and set aside without much thought, assuming perhaps that the woman had once been a governess or a lady's companion. Some position that might account for refined speech without refined means. "I am simply tired," Clemency said, settling the old woman into the warm seat and drawing her own cloak a little tighter against the station's draught. "And I have 2 good legs and a coach that will not leave for another hour yet, regardless of where I sit while I wait. Please rest. I will find you something warm to drink if the innkeeper across the square has anything left at this hour." She did not wait for the old woman to protest, crossing instead to the small station counter where a bored clerk sold what modest refreshments the station kept on hand, and she returned within minutes with a cup of hot broth purchased with coins she could ill afford to spend. "That she would spend anyway, I could not possibly," the old woman began. But Clemency pressed the cup gently into her hands, regardless. "You could, and you will," Clemency said, with the particular gentle firmness she used on stray cats too proud to accept food they plainly needed. "I have watched you walk in here as though your legs might give out entirely, and I would not forgive myself if I let you go another hour without something warm in your belly. Please, humor me." The old woman studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her tired eyes, and then, slowly, she accepted the cup and drank, and color began gradually to return to her pale cheeks. "What is your name, child?" she asked once the broth was half finished. "Clemency Ward," she said. "I keep the thread shop on Millbrook's High Street, though I do not imagine that means very much to a traveller passing through." "It means," the old woman said quietly, "a great deal more than you seem to realize." Clemency did not press her on what she meant by that, assuming it was simply the tired gratitude of a woman who had expected far less kindness from a stranger than she had just received. And the 2 of them sat together by the stove for the better part of an hour. The old woman's evident fondness for a particular kind of chamomile tea that Clemency promised before they parted to seek out for her own shop's modest stock. When the coach finally arrived, the old woman rose with visibly renewed strength, and she took Clemency's hand in both of her own before they parted, an oddly formal gesture for so brief an acquaintance, and told her, with a warmth that seemed to carry more weight than the words themselves suggested, that she would not soon forget the kindness of a shopkeeper's daughter who had given up her own warm seat for a stranger she owed nothing at all. Clemency thought little more of the encounter in the days that followed, occupied as she was with the ordinary business of running her small shop, mending the roof where the recent rains had begun to leak, and managing the modest debts owed to her by half the village. And she certainly did not connect the frail traveller from the coach station to anything of consequence when, some 3 weeks later, a fine carriage bearing an unfamiliar crest rolled to a stop directly outside her narrow shop front. The man who descended from the carriage was tall, dressed in dark, well-tailored wool, with an authority in his bearing that immediately marked him as someone of considerable standing, and Clemency, watching through her shop window with growing alarm, recognized nothing about him at all, though she noted, with a small and inexplicable jolt, something familiar in the particular precision of his diction when he entered her shop and asked quite simply whether she was the proprietor. "I am," she said, wiping her hands on her apron, uncertain what business a man so obviously wealthy might have with a shop that sold thread and buttons to villagers who mostly paid on credit. "My name is Edmund Thorne," he said, "Duke of Ashworth, and I have come to Millbrook specifically to find you, Miss Ward, though I suspect you have no idea why." Clemency felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, for the name Ashworth was known even in a village as small as Millbrook, the seat of one of the wealthiest and most influential families in the entire county, and she could not for the life of her imagine what business a duke might have with her modest little shop. "Your Grace," she said, and dropped into an awkward curtsy that felt entirely inadequate to the moment, "I confess I do not understand. Have I done something to offend the estate? I have paid every tithe owed, and I do not believe I owe any debt to." "You have done nothing to offend anyone," the Duke said, and something in his expression softened considerably. Quite the opposite, in fact. 3 weeks ago, at the coach station in this very village, you gave up your seat by the fire to an old woman who could barely stand, and you bought her broth with coins I suspect you could scarcely spare, and you spoke to her with a kindness she has not soon stopped speaking of since. That woman, Miss Ward, was my mother, the Dowager Duchess Rosalind, and she has asked me to find you and to thank you personally for a kindness that I am told quite moved her." Clemency stood frozen for a long moment, the pieces settling into place with a slow, dawning horror, for she remembered now, with painful clarity, the precise cultured diction of the old woman's speech that had struck her as odd against her plain travelling clothes, and she understood in that instant exactly whose hand she had held, whose broth she had purchased with her own hard-earned coin, whose exhaustion she had eased without ever suspecting the truth of who sat before her. "I did not know," she managed finally. "I would have helped her regardless, Your Grace, whether she had been a duchess or a beggar. I hope you understand that. I did not offer my seat because I hoped for any reward." "That," the Duke said, "is precisely why my mother insisted I come, Miss Ward. She has spent a lifetime surrounded by people who offer kindness only when they suspect it might be profitable, and she found herself at a coach station on an ordinary rainy evening in the company of the one person in that station who had no possible reason to know who she was and who helped her anyway, simply because helping her was the right thing to do. She has not stopped speaking of it since, and she has asked, quite specifically, that I extend an invitation for you to visit Ashworth Hall at your earliest convenience so that she might thank you properly." Word of the Duke's visit to Clemency's modest shop spread through Millbrook within the hour, as such news inevitably does in villages this small, and by the time evening fell, half the village had heard some version of the story, most of them wildly exaggerated, and among those who took the greatest and least charitable interest in the news was Millicent Bragg, the wife of the village's wealthiest landowner, a woman who had long regarded her own social standing as considerably above Clemency's modest circumstances, and who received the news of the Duke's personal visit with an expression of open incredulity, quickly curdled into something colder and more calculating. Millicent Bragg had spent years cultivating connections she believed would eventually secure her own daughter, Prudence a match well above the family's actual standing, and the notion that a penniless shopkeeper's daughter might have stumbled through nothing more than an accident of misplaced kindness into the personal favour of the Ashworth family struck her as an intolerable disruption to the natural order she had spent so long arranging in her family's favour. "It is absurd," Millicent told her husband that evening, pacing before the parlour fire with a fury she did not trouble to disguise. "A shopkeeper invited to Ashworth Hall, while our own Prudence has been introduced at every assembly in the county, without once catching the Duke's notice. There must be some mistake, or some scheme on the girl's part, for I cannot believe a Duke's mother would simply wander into a coach station unattended and unrecognized." Her husband, a placid man more interested in his ledgers than his wife's social ambitions, suggested mildly that perhaps the story was exactly as simple as it appeared, that Clemency Ward had shown a kindness to a tired old woman without any notion of who she was, but Millicent dismissed this possibility with a wave of her hand. already turning her considerable energy toward the question of how such an unwelcome development might yet be undone before it threatened her own carefully laid plans. Clemency, unaware of the storm gathering against her, travelled to Ashworth Hall the following week, in a state of nervous disbelief that had not fully abated even as the carriage the Duke sent for her rolled up the long tree-lined drive toward an estate grander than anything she had ever imagined, let alone visited. She was shown into a drawing-room where the Dowager Duchess Rosalind sat waiting, dressed now in fine silk rather than a plain travelling cloak, though her face, when she looked up and saw Clemency enter, broke immediately into a warmth that reminded Clemency instantly of the tired gratitude she had shown at the coach station weeks before. "My dear girl," the Duchess said, rising with considerably more strength than she had shown that rainy evening and taking both of Clemency's hands in her own. "I have thought of you nearly every day since that evening, and I confess I have grown quite impatient, waiting for my son to arrange this visit. Sit, please, and let me finally thank you properly for a kindness I have not forgotten and do not intend to." Over tea, the Duchess explained what had brought her unattended and disguised in plain travelling clothes to a coach station so far from her own grand estate, story that unfolded slowly and revealed, layer by layer, a woman who had grown deeply weary of being valued only for her title and her fortune, who had taken to occasionally travelling without her usual retinue of servants, specifically to discover, in ordinary encounters with ordinary people, who, among her acquaintance and among strangers alike, might treat her with genuine warmth rather than calculated deference. "I have been disappointed more often than I care to admit," the Duchess said, "by people who discover my true rank only after they have already shown me their true nature, and I confess I had begun to despair of finding anyone who might treat an old woman kindly, simply because kindness costs nothing to extend and means everything to receive. You did not know me, Miss Ward. You gave up your seat and your coin to a stranger who might have been anyone at all, and that, I think, is worth a great deal more than any title I carry." Clemency, moved nearly to tears by the warmth of the Duchess's gratitude, insisted that she had done nothing extraordinary, that any decent person would have done the same, but the Duchess merely smiled and told her gently that she had lived long enough in the company of the wealthy. It was during this same visit that Clemency first encountered the Duke's cousin, a sharp-featured man named Reginald Ashworth, who managed a considerable portion of the estate's financial affairs on the Duke's behalf, and who watched Clemency's growing friendship with the Dowager Duchess and in her innocence entirely failed to notice. Reginald had spent years quietly diverting funds from the estate's tenant rents into accounts he controlled privately, a scheme made considerably easier by the Duke's frequent absences in the capital and the Dowager Duchess's growing frailty, and he understood immediately that a shopkeeper's daughter drawn suddenly into the family's inner confidence, a woman with no fortune of her own to protect, and therefore, in his calculation, considerable motive to seek advantage wherever she might find it, represented either a useful pawn or a dangerous complication to his carefully managed theft, depending entirely on how the situation unfolded. The Duke himself, meanwhile, found his own attention drawn to Clemency in ways that surprised him rather more than he cared to admit, for he had spent years since a broken engagement to a woman who had cared considerably more for his title than for his character, growing increasingly guarded against the possibility, certain that any warmth shown to him by a woman of society was calculated rather than sincere. Clemency, however, showed no interest whatsoever in his title, asked him instead about his mother's health, about the state of the estate's tenant farms, about whether the Dowager Duchess's fondness for chamomile tea had been properly indulged since her return from her travels, and Edmund Thorne found himself, over the course of several subsequent visits, Increasingly unable to stay away from a woman who seemed entirely and refreshingly indifferent to everything about him except the parts of his character she could observe directly for herself. Millicent Bragg, watching this growing intimacy from the periphery of village gossip with mounting fury, decided that the situation required more direct intervention than mere disapproval could provide, and she began with the same careful calculation she applied to all her social maneuvering, to spread rumors through the county that painted Clemency's kindness toward the Dowager Duchess in an entirely different light, suggesting that the shopkeeper's daughter had, in fact, recognized the old woman immediately at the coach station and had staged her apparent ignorance and generosity entirely as a calculated scheme to worm her way into the Ashworth family's favor and fortune. The rumors spread with the particular speed that malicious gossip always seems to achieve in small villages, and within a fortnight Clemency began to notice a coldness in the village she had not experienced before. Customers who had once greeted her warmly, now crossing the street to avoid her shop entirely. Whispered conversations that fell silent whenever she passed, and she understood, with a sinking heart, that someone had begun deliberately poisoning her reputation, though she could not yet guess who or why. The rumours reached Ashworth Hall not long after, carried by Reginald himself, who saw in the gossip an opportunity to advance his own careful scheme, and he brought the accusation directly to the Duke with an expression of grave, manufactured concern. "I would not trouble you with mere village gossip, cousin," Reginald said, "were the matter not already spreading so widely. But I have heard from more than one source that Miss Ward's apparent ignorance of your mother's identity may have been rather less genuine than it first appeared, that she in fact recognized the Dowager Duchess immediately and calculated her kindness quite deliberately, hoping precisely for the sort of favor and attention she has since received. I say this only out of concern for the family's reputation and for your own heart, which I fear may be rather more engaged in this matter than prudence might advise." The Duke, though he did not wish to credit such an accusation, found himself troubled despite his own instincts, for he had been wounded once before by a woman whose apparent affection had proven calculated rather than sincere, and the seed of doubt Reginald planted, however unwillingly, began to take root, despite everything Clemency's actual behavior had shown him. The confrontation came at a harvest banquet held at Ashworth Hall, an event to which Clemency had been invited at the Dowager Duchess's specific insistence, and which Millicent Bragg had, through considerable social manoeuvring of her own, also managed to secure an invitation to attend. Arriving with her daughter Prudence, dressed in the finest silk the family's fortune could still afford, and wearing an expression of triumphant anticipation that Clemency, entering the grand hall in her own modest but carefully mended gown, did not yet understand the meaning of. The banquet proceeded pleasantly enough through its early courses, the Dowager Duchess seating Clemency near her own place of honour with a warmth that did not go unnoticed by the assembled guests, until Millicent Bragg, emboldened by wine and by weeks of carefully cultivated resentment, rose from her own seat part way through the meal and addressed the table with a voice pitched deliberately to carry. "I wonder," she said, "whether the assembled company has heard the full truth of how Miss Ward came to enjoy such particular favour with the Dowager Duchess. I have it on good authority that she recognized her Grace immediately at that coach station, and that her celebrated kindness was, in fact, rather more calculated than the story generally told would suggest, a clever scheme by a penniless shopkeeper's daughter." The hall fell into a stunned, uncomfortable silence, every eye turning toward Clemency, whose face drained of colour as the accusation settled over the gathered company, and she felt, in that terrible moment, the full weight of a lie she had no immediate way to disprove. How does one demonstrate conclusively that ignorance, rather than calculation, had driven a kindness offered weeks before to a stranger in a coach station? She looked toward the Duke, hoping to find in his expression the same unwavering trust he had shown her in every prior visit, and found instead, to her growing horror, a flicker of uncertainty, the seed Reginald had planted finally showing its bitter fruit at precisely the moment it could do the most damage. "Edmund," the Dowager Duchess said sharply, before her son could speak, rising from her own seat with a strength that silenced the room more effectively than any accusation could. "I was there. I sat beside this young woman for the better part of an hour, and I promise you, on my own honor, that she showed not the faintest sign of recognizing me, not until you yourself came to her shop and told her plainly who I was. I have lived a very long life, surrounded by people skilled at calculated flattery, and I assure this entire company that I know the difference between genuine kindness and performance, and what I received from Miss Ward at that coach station was entirely and unmistakably genuine." Millicent Bragg, undeterred even by the Dowager Duchess's direct rebuke, pressed further, suggesting that perhaps her Grace, given her age and the acknowledged frailty she had shown that evening, might simply have been mistaken in her assessment, a suggestion so bold and so cutting. And it was into this charged silence that Reginald Ashworth, sensing an opportunity to deepen the damage his own scheme required, added his own careful contribution. "I do not say this lightly," he said, "but I have taken the liberty of making certain inquiries into Miss Ward's financial circumstances, given the family's evident interest in her welfare, and I have discovered that her small shop carries debts considerably larger than she has previously disclosed. Provide rather more motive for calculated ambition than any of us would care to credit." This was, in fact, an outright fabrication, constructed by Reginald specifically to deepen suspicion against Clemency at precisely the moment his own theft from the estate's tenant rents was closest to discovery. 4. He understood that a scandal surrounding the Duke's new favorite might occupy the family's attention long enough to allow him to quietly cover the gaps in his own accounts before anyone thought to examine them closely. Clemency, standing now at the center of a hall full of accusing eyes, felt something harden inside her that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with the plain, simple truth of what she had done and why, and she found her voice at last, steady despite the trembling she felt in her own hands. "I will not pretend to a wealth I do not have," she said, "for my shop has always struggled, and I have never once claimed otherwise to anyone in this hall. That I did not offer my seat to her Grace because I calculated any advantage from it. Your Grace, my lady, I ask you all to consider plainly what advantage a penniless shopkeeper could possibly have expected from an old woman travelling alone in plain clothes on a rainy evening, with no servants, no carriage, no outward sign whatsoever of her true rank. I gave up my seat because she looked tired and cold, and I would have done precisely the same for any traveller in that station that evening, whether duchess or beggar, and I find it a strange sort of justice that the very ordinariness of my kindness is now being twisted into evidence of some elaborate scheme I would not have had the first notion how to construct." The Duke, watching Clemency speak with a dignity that reminded him with sudden painful clarity of exactly why he had come to care for her in the first place, felt the last of Reginald's planted doubt dissolve entirely, replaced by a fierce and protective anger at himself for having entertained the accusation even briefly. "Enough," he said, rising to his feet with an authority that silenced the hall completely. "I have known Miss Ward for some weeks now, and I have watched her interact with my mother, with the estate's tenants, with the servants of this very household, and never once, not for a single moment, have I observed anything in her behavior but genuine. I confess I allowed a moment's doubt to cloud my judgment this evening, a failing I intend to correct immediately, and I would ask, Lady Bragg, Precisely what evidence, beyond rumour and speculation, you have to support so serious an accusation against a woman's character? Millicent, caught without any actual proof beyond the malicious gossip she herself had helped spread, faltered visibly, and it was in this moment of her hesitation that a quiet voice from among the estate's own servants, a woman named Harriet who managed the household accounts, stepped forward with an expression of grave and long-suppressed concern. "Your Grace," Harriet said, "I have hesitated to speak of this matter, fearing I lacked sufficient proof. But I have noticed, these past several months, discrepancies in the tenant rent accounts that Mr. Plaxpree, Reginald manages on your behalf, sums that do not match the ledgers I myself keep for the household's daily affairs. And I wonder now, given the accusations flying so freely this evening, whether it might not be worth examining precisely who among this company has the greatest motive." The colour drained rapidly from Reginald's face, as every eye in the hall turned now toward him instead, and the Duke, understanding immediately the implication Harriet had raised, called for the estate's ledgers to be brought at once, along with the household's own separate records, so that the two might be compared directly before the assembled company. What followed over the next hour was a methodical, devastating unravelling of Reginald's careful theft, discrepancies stretching back nearly 3 years, rents collected from tenant farms that never appeared in the estate's official accounts, sums quietly diverted into private holdings that Reginald had believed thoroughly concealed behind layers of complicated bookkeeping. And, as each new discrepancy was read aloud before the horrified assembly, Reginald's protests grew weaker and less convincing, until finally he abandoned the pretense entirely. Summoned urgently from the village, could formally place him under arrest. Millicent Bragg, watching her carefully constructed scandal collapse entirely into a far greater one of her own unwitting making, attempted a hasty retreat of her own, but the Dowager Duchess, still standing at the head of the table, with the particular commanding presence of a woman who had spent decades navigating precisely this sort of social treachery, stopped her before she could reach the door. "You have spent this evening attempting to destroy the reputation of a young woman whose only crime was showing kindness to a stranger," the Duchess said, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent hall. "And I find myself wondering, Lady Bragg, beyond the petty satisfaction of seeing someone more deserving than your own daughter humbled in public, I would ask that you consider very carefully, before you attend any future gathering at Ashworth Hall, whether your own conduct this evening reflects the sort of character this family wishes to associate with." Millicent left the hall in humiliated silence, her daughter Prudence trailing behind her with an expression of mortification that suggested she, at least, understood the full scope of what her mother's scheming had cost the family's own standing in the county. In the weeks that followed the banquet, Reginald Ashworth was formally tried and convicted of fraud against the estate, the full extent of his theft finally exposed, and the stolen funds ordered returned to the tenant families he had quietly wronged for years. And the scandal that Millicent Bragg had hoped would destroy Clemency's reputation instead cemented it entirely, for the whole county now knew the true story, not merely of a shopkeeper's daughter who had shown genuine kindness to a stranger, but of a woman whose steady honesty under public accusation had helped expose a fraud that might otherwise have continued undetected for years to come. The Dowager Duchess, delighted by this vindication, insisted that Clemency be welcomed permanently into the family's inner circle, and Edmund Thorne, freed at last from the doubt Reginald had so carefully planted, found himself no longer able to deny the affection that had been growing steadily since that first visit to her modest little shop. He proposed to her on a quiet afternoon in the estate's gardens, not with any grand public display, but with the simple, direct sincerity that had characterized their entire acquaintance, telling her that he had spent years, assuming any warmth shown to him by a woman must be calculated, until a shopkeeper's daughter had shown him, through nothing more than an ordinary act of kindness to a stranger, she did not recognize exactly what genuine affection looked like when it expected nothing in return. Clemency, standing among the estate's autumn roses with a happiness she had not thought possible for a woman of her modest circumstances, accepted, and the wedding that followed that spring filled the small stone church at Millbrook with a congregation as varied as the county itself, tenant farmers, the Dowager Duchess Rosalind seated proudly in the front pew beside the very shop counter's worth of thread and buttons that had once been the whole of Clemency's fortune. In the years that followed, Ashworth Hall became known throughout the county for a particular warmth it had not shown before. Tenant grievances heard personally, rather than filtered through a steward's calculating hand, a standing arrangement whereby any traveller passing through the county might find shelter and a warm meal at the estate's gates, regardless of their apparent means, for Clemency had not forgotten, even amid the grandeur of her new life, precisely what it meant to offer kindness to a stranger without any promise of return. And the story of the coach station, of a tired old woman and a shopkeeper's daughter who gave up her warm seat without a second thought, became known throughout the county not merely as the origin of a fortunate marriage, but as a plain and enduring reminder that the truest measure of a person's character is found not in how they treat those who might reward them, but in how freely they offer kindness to those who, so far as they know, never can.